Benjamin Franklin Crookston was born of Ann Welch and Robert Crookston. He was one of 10 boys, and one of his brothers told a couple stories of Frank Crookston. So during the early days of Cache Valley history, the settlers would frequently be troubled by the Indians who would steal their horses and run off their cattle. To combat this menace, the pioneers organized a defensive group known as the Minutemen. My brother Frank was a member of this group. The Minutemen were required to have a fine saddle horse which they kept in readiness in case of Indian trouble. At a single ring by the big curfew bell in the tithing yard, these men would gather together immediately at the meeting place. This was a large pasture located on South Main and Logan on the north bank of the river. They would ride in hot pursuit of the Indians. One warm day in July, word came that the Indians had raided Richmond and had driven off some cattle during the night. The Minutemen gathered and were in hot pursuit. When reaching Richmond, they learned that the Indians had gone north towards Franklin. They reached the village at noon. The weather was warm, the riders were hot and dusty, and so they decided to stop and rest. There are many hollows and canyons between Richmond and Franklin, and the Indians would have gone up any one of them and be concealed by the brush. So it was decided to send some scouts ahead. They were to ride up to the top of Franklin Mountain, just west of Franklin. From that particular vantage point, they could pretty well see the whole area. Frank and a jolly little Welchman named Hopkins were chosen to go. If they caught sight of the Indians, they were to fire 2 shots and the rest of the company would join them. The 2 men reached the summit and looked over the landscape. No sign of Indians or cattle, which with such a head start, the Indians could be miles up one of the canyons. Being tired, Frank and Hopkins decided to rest a bit. They laid on the ground and watched the clouds floating by. Suddenly, a buzzard circled overhead. That was an immediate challenge. Which one could hit it? First Hopkins shot and missed. Frank shot and missed. Oh well, it was a good try. They continued to lie and doze, enjoying the warmer sunshine. Suddenly there was a sound of hoofbeats and the shouts of men. Where are they? The Minutemen demanded. Where are who? The suddenly aroused scouts asked. The Indians, of course. You fired 2 shots. Frank and Hopkins felt very sheepish. It was too late to continue the search, so they all headed for Logan. Frank and Hopkins were in disgrace, their guns were taken from them, and they were forced to ride at the end of the column. Nick also tells another story. One of the duties of the Minutemen was to act as a courier to get word to the colonel at Fort Douglas in case of an Indian emergency. The Minutemen would ride at full speed to Wellsville, about 10 miles away. He would give the message to the rider there, who would proceed to Brigham City, where he in turn gave it to a fresh rider, and thus it was relayed to Fort Douglas. My brother Frank Crookston was assigned the duty to deliver a message. It seemed there had been an Indian scare, and it was felt the troops should be called. Some renegade had provided whiskey for some braves, and they were making threats which alarmed the settlers. It was afternoon when Frank saddled his horse and headed for Wellsville. As he galloped past College Ward and he observed the large herd of cattle grazing the pasture, each spring large numbers of church tithing cattle were driven up from the lower valleys to summer on the church farm. He noticed that 2 herders were sitting on their horses chatting as they watched the animals. Everything seemed so peaceful. Surely no Indian danger could threaten. When he reached Wellsville, he delivered the message, then rested his tired mount while he ate his meager lunch. It was evening when he finally started for home. A full moon rose above the mountains to the east, and as it grew darker, the moon cast radiance over the landscape. He jogged along at a leisurely pace. Nearing the church farm, he observed no signs of life. The cattle were bedded down, and their herders evidently had turned in for the night. It was just too peaceful. Suddenly, an uncontrollable urge seized him. Spurring his horse to a full gallop, he rushed to the tent, which he encircled several times, all the time whooping and shouting like a dozen Comanches. He then left quietly and slowly resumed his journey. When he arrived in Logan, he was astonished to meet the Minutemen, mounted and riding furiously. He turned and rode along with one man, inquiring as they rode, "What's the trouble?" Indian trouble, the rider shouted. It seemed a whole band of Indians had attacked the herders on the church farm. They had barely escaped with their lives. They had to manage to elude the Indians and had headed for Logan Cross lots without even stopping to put on their clothes. No doubt by now the Indians had driven off the cattle. Chuckling to himself, Frank headed back to town, explaining his horse was too spent to join in the pursuit. "But good luck to you. Hope you find those Indians," was Frank's parting shot.